Thank you, Sarah. I think you've got me unmuted. To you and Randy, to everyone's on here in Interfaith Action, thank you for inviting me. More importantly, thank you for the work you've done for a very long time in community, especially now around food insecurity and some of the issues that between COVID-19 and the civil unrest by the killing of George Floyd. I'm really grateful. I think it's important now more than ever. I took one of my first trips out of St. Paul since COVID has started, when I went up to Duluth on Monday. And I think talk about the line of history was why we were up there. And you think being a school teacher from Mankato, early in our state's history, one of the most infamous acts in American history was the mass execution at the hand of the government of 38 Dakota men down on Riverfront Drive. And every December 26th, since I lived in Mankato, I would take my children down and we would note our history. And then in Duluth, I was there on Monday because it was a June day in 1920, as the nation was reeling from the Spanish flu, that Misters Clayton, Jackson, and McGee were pulled from the county jail, from the city jail, and hung by a light post for an alleged attack that did not happen. We were able to issue the pardon for Max Mason, the first one in our state's history, who was also accused unjustly of that act 100 years late. And then just 3 weeks ago on the streets of Minneapolis, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, George Floyd was murdered in front of the world. So it's an uncomfortable part of our history. It is a direct line that is part of our history. And these are uncomfortable conversations. And as trusted faith leaders, you are the ones that have to have them, because the healing will not happen. When I took my 19-year-old with me to Duluth, she talked about how they did not learn about the lynching in school in Minnesota, even though we're cited 10,000 people gathered on the streets of Duluth to watch that. And postcards were printed and sold for many years afterwards, marking that event. So I'm just grateful that there's a group of folks on here that understand the importance of the moment that we're in. I tend to try and understand both my place and the place our history is at, and not overstate how important it is just because it happens to be us who are alive right now. But I do think in this moment, it's probably an accurate statement that if we are going to break that line and take it in a different direction, now is probably the last best time we will have to do that in Minnesota. And the conversations that are happening in the legislature certainly matter, but I would make the case that the conversations that are happening in our places of worship, on our street corners, in our businesses, are the true changes. So I'm just grateful to be with you. The compassion that we need to show, the values as faith leaders on here are the values that we want every single person in Minnesota to be able to experience. And the harsh reality is that a large number of folks were able to tell ourselves we were a very exceptional state in so many ways, and just conveniently forget the fact that many did not enjoy either the economic benefits, the educational benefits, the health benefits, or just the simple benefit of getting in your car and driving without anxiety. So I'm glad to be with you. These are challenging times, but I also think as people of faith, things happen for a reason. You are called to that work for a reason. And I think all of us are intersecting at an absolutely critical time. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Governor Walz. And I will turn this over to our Executive Director, Randy Roth from Interfaith Action.
Thank you so much, Governor Walz. Thanks for being with us. It means a lot to us. Interfaith Action believes that opportunity grows and poverty recedes when people of faith commit themselves to making a difference. Interfaith Action provides the infrastructure that enables about 100 diverse faith communities to invest themselves effectively in the stability and economic mobility of their neighbors. The work of your congregants, our faith community volunteers, includes providing more than 10,000 shelter bed nights a year for families with children experiencing homelessness. Emergency services, including distributing more than 120,000 pounds of food a year in our American Indian community. Literacy tutoring, job coaching, GED teaching, legal and financial education, social work counseling, legal clinics, and more, all to support and assist families seeking stability and economic mobility. Interfaith Action also hosts clergy civic engagement sessions like this, bringing clergy of many faiths together with civic leaders and key thought leaders of our time. Reverend Darrin Goss is one of those key leaders. As president and CEO of the Coastal Community Foundation of South Carolina, he helped lead Charleston's response after the massacre at the Mother Emanuel AME Church 5 years ago yesterday. Reverend Goss is an ordained minister with the Baptist Educational Missionary Convention of South Carolina. Before becoming president of the Coastal Community Foundation, Reverend Goss served in the United States Army, served as the senior pastor of 3 churches, and served in several other key leadership roles in philanthropy. Finally, Reverend Goss serves as the board chair of MDC, a critically important national nonprofit that works to make the South a region where equity prevails and all people thrive. It's my great honor to welcome my friend and colleague, Reverend Darrin Goss, to speak with the faith leaders of Minnesota. Reverend Goss.
Randy, thank you. And thank you all for frankly honoring me and our great city of Charleston with your presence here this morning. Governor Walz, thank you for taking the time to be on this call. I know you are very busy tending to the business of your great state. And so I appreciate you being here on this call this morning. And then my colleague and friend and mentor, David Dotson, sir, thank you for being on this call as well. Randy has become a fast friend and ally and colleague. And as the events of a few weeks ago started unfolding, we began to text each other. And at first it was, Randy, I'm praying for you in your city. I see what's going on. A couple of days into that and into the weekend, she texted me back as some things started happening here in Charleston that first weekend of the George Floyd murder. Darrin, I'm praying for you in your city. And I think out of those conversations, we find ourselves here. And so what I want to be able to do today is just to talk a little bit about the faith, not only the faith response to the Mother Emanuel massacre that happened 5 years ago yesterday, but the broader community response and the unique way, I think, in which the faith community, the civic community, philanthropy really can and do work together in ways that can make substantive differences and changes. Randy's asked me to share some of that as well as some of our lessons learned. And I'm happy to do that. So I'll spend some time sort of setting some context, talk about what was going on in Charleston at the time, talk about the immediate response to the Mother Emanuel massacre, and then really spend the balance of our time together talking about what we've done since, frankly, June 17th, 2015. Before I get started with that, I would like to offer us just an opening prayer. Will you pray with me? God of heaven and earth, God of all creation, the God that sees far and wide, we come into your presence at this moment, and heaviness of all the things that our eyes have seen, our ears have heard, and our hearts have carried. And we turn to you now for strength, for hope, for inspiration, for power to do the work that you have called each and every one of us to do at this moment, not just for ourselves, our individual congregations, but for our cities, for our communities, and for our country. Let us be an example of what love is and what it should manifest itself to be in everyone we come in contact with, and every day we are privileged to walk among the living. God, we thank you for this time that we will share together. In your name we pray. Amen. To just set the context of what was going on in Charleston on June 17, 2015, and that's the event that everyone remembers, that we all talk about here, that we just spent a significant amount of time celebrating. I really have to start, frankly, a year earlier. And if you really know and understand the history of Charleston, South Carolina, and South Carolina in general, the context around what was so shocking about the immediate aftermath of Mother Emanuel is really rooted in a history and a city that's been really the epicenter of injustices, slavery, for the most part. Our port, Gadsden's Wharf, really was the entry point for more than half the enslaved Africans that came to our country. Many people of African descent migrated from these shores to places around our country. So Charleston, South Carolina shares that history. Like the governor mentioned, in the Red Summer of 1919, Charleston was not exempt from the riots and the killings of African Americans. We had our own riot here in Charleston. A young man, Isaac Doctor, killed by two naval servicemen from the nearby naval base. Actually, I'm sitting on the naval base and my new office is here. So we're steeped in that history. This is a city who's had a very complex history with race. My own family, my great-great-grandfather came to Charleston after serving in the Civil War in the Navy because he found in Charleston opportunity. He found in Charleston, as we've studied and learned, a place where he felt comfortable enough to raise his family post-Civil War in 1884 during that brief period right after Reconstruction. And so Charleston carries with it this real identity of being what we call the Holy City, a city where congregations of different faiths. We have one of the oldest Jewish congregations continuously operating in our city, KKBE, led by Stephanie Alexander, who was here during the Mother Emanuel Massacre and provided great leadership. We have Mother Emanuel Church itself, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, African Methodist Episcopal Church south of Baltimore, in operation here in the city of Charleston, literally a block and a half, 2 blocks away from Marion Square, where the Calhoun statue still sits atop that square. So Charleston is, as I define it, and we have come known, a city of contradictions, a city of incredible faith, but also a city of incredible suffering. And so in 2014, that July, almost a year before the Mother Emanuel Massacre, there was a young man, Denzel Cornell, who was mysteriously killed. The reports say that he committed suicide. The only witness on the scene was a police officer and a couple of witnesses in a housing project on the east side of Charleston. But that event a year earlier really started to create some civil unrest in the city. The police chief at the time, Chief Greg Mullen, had come under significant pressure from a group called the Charleston Area Justice Ministries, not unlike your group, that had been working for, at that point, had been 15 years to try to do and introduce police reform to the City of Charleston Police Department as well as the North Charleston Police Department. It's the context we found ourselves in. That context was also a city that had been quickly gentrifying with people moving back into Charleston. The naval base had closed in the early 90s. A lot of folks had moved away, but industry had come back. And so Charleston was quickly gentrifying. The racial, economic, educational, healthcare disparities were becoming significant, and everyone could see that and feel it. You know about the first real sort of televised police killing of an unarmed Black man to hit the national news was Walter Scott. In April of 2015, Walter Scott, on a routine traffic stop for a taillight being out, was essentially killed by a North Charleston Police Department, literally not more than a mile away from my office, where we sit here. That happened in April 4th, 2015. And then and 2 months later in June, the Mother Emanuel massacre. And just some context around what we know and what you've probably read about Dylann Roof and why he targeted Charleston and specifically the Mother Emanuel Church. Dylann Roof was a self-avowed white supremacist and had enough conscientiousness about history and the importance of Mother Emanuel AME Church to Charleston that he specifically targeted that church and specifically targeted at a Bible study to incite a race riot. I think he understood sort of the context. He's from Columbia, about an hour and a half from here, just to drive down I-26 to Charleston, and understood, frankly, the potential powder keg Charleston was at the time. And so intentionally sought to create a race riot. Reverend Clemente Pinckney, who was a state senator who represented Jasper, Beaufort, and Charleston counties, was the pastor of the church. His wife, Jennifer, and youngest daughter, Milana, was in the church. Jennifer, Milana, and Eliana, their oldest daughter, still continue to be involved. I'll talk a little bit about their involvement in the recovery and the work that we've been doing the last 5 years. But he targeted that church for a reason. And he was very strategic in that. When the murders happened that night, I was still living in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. My mom called me on the telephone and said, Darrin, they shot up the church. And if you grew up in Charleston like I did, and you're aware of the church, I had no doubt that she was talking about Mother Emanuel. I quickly turned on the news and saw the reports and saw what was unfolding and was just in disbelief. And here's where I think faith and opportunity comes in. That night on the phone with my mother, I just whispered a simple prayer. Lord, if you could get me back to South Carolina, get me back to Charleston to be a part of healing our community and the hard work that will be necessary to move forward, I'm open for it. Now, little did I know a couple of months later, I'd be in this process to come and lead the Community Foundation, but I feel blessed about that, about the opportunity I've had here. The night of the event, and I shared this with Randy and Sarah the other day, there were some things that had been happening in South Carolina and specifically in Charleston. We had the benefit of a very strong and consistent mayor, Mayor Joe Riley, who had been the mayor of Charleston for 40 years, who had relationships with the faith community, with the business community, with the Black civic community, across the board and by and large. When Joe Riley called people together, people came. And on that night, literally with people still trying to figure out what's going on, the disorientation of the mass casualty that had taken place, Mayor Riley and Cress Darwin, who is the pastor of Second Presbyterian Church, literally that shares a parking lot with Mother Emanuel, and other leaders from around the community gathered those leaders. Chief Mullen was a part of that. And the first thing they did was the faith community came together and started leading literally in prayer, and started the process of helping families come to grips with what was going on. So the counseling aspect took place right away. And not just the families, but the broader congregation. Bishop Goff and others who were a part of the AME Church quickly came to Charleston. The faith community in every way stepped up to provide immediate triage, counseling, and frankly support to the city of Charleston, who was frankly grieving at what had happened to the church. I heard this story from Dr. Kylon Middleton, who pastors Mount Zion AME Church, which is a sister church of Mother Emanuel, who he and Kylon were, he and Clemente Pinckney were like brothers, really good friends. And he said he was pastoring a church in Georgetown, South Carolina at the time, about an hour and a half drive up 17. And he said he came into the city and, you know, rioters and others were starting to gather around and try to do some things to be disruptive. And he said the most amazing thing, faith leaders of every stripe gathered around a church arm in arm and started praying and singing hymns. And that is what caused the peaceful protest that you saw. That symbology of love, not hate, of healing, that event, that show that night was what really set the tone of what would happen in the subsequent weeks to follow, because we had more of that. People see the pictures of the gathering and the vigils outside the church, the big mass gathering on the Ravenel Bridge that you could see from all over Charleston. But that outpouring of Reverend Manning, who's the current pastor of Mother Emanuel, will tell you that ministry of presence, people who weren't from Charleston came here, ministers, faith leaders. They came here and this community welcomed them, and they were, frankly, the counselors, the critical mass of people that this community needed to move forward in the healing process. The fact is, weeks and months after that, when charges came to Dylan Roof, the faith community continued to do its ministry of healing, because throughout every court case, the Charleston area chaplain's crisis was there, churches were there. Jeremy Rutledge, who is the lead pastor of Circular Churches, a downtown church, he was there. So they did both the ministry of healing, but they also, on the other hand, through the Charleston Area Justice Ministries, really understood that there needed to be some structural changes. And so, as I mentioned earlier, they had been working on police reform for 20 years before this, and they continued to work on police reform. Just because they were there to heal and to counsel and to pray and to sing hymns, they continued to be laser focused on the social issues that were plaguing our community, to the degree that they stood up an organization called the Illumination Project, led by Dr. Middleton and Pastor Rutledge. And that group created and enforced, required a police audit. The city of Charleston, initially under Chief Mullen, declined to do it. He was quickly dispatched and moved on in 2016. Our new chief Luther Reynolds, has actually embraced the audit, performed it, and is now making changes to police training and all those things, it well in advance of what happened 3 weeks ago. The North Charleston Police Department has changed significantly. Chief Reggie Burgess, who is a Charleston native, a North Charleston native African-American, is the chief of police. He has committed to sending all 350 of his patrol officers through the Racial Equity Institute in acknowledgement that there's some work to do. They still haven't gotten the audit done and some other things, but they're working on that. And then the Charleston Area Justice Ministries is still working every day on the social issues, the economic injustice, the other social justice issues that they're working on are important: housing, healthcare access. So all that's going on, and the faith community, frankly, has been leaders all the way through this. Nelson Rivers, who is a pastor's Charity Missionary Baptist Church here in North Charleston, and is a second vice president of the National Action Network, had been the state president of our state NAACP. Says of the recovery work as it relates to the faith community. He says these words: "We were long on symbolism in terms of the protests and all of those things. I mean, the vigils and the prayers and all of those things. But in his analysis, and we talked a few days ago, in his analysis, it was just the Charleston Area Justice Ministries, led by more progressive churches, that have kept up the work, but if the same support by larger mainstream white congregations had just stayed with it, then what happened just a few weeks ago in the aftermath of George Floyd may have well been avoided, because we could have really moved forward some of the structural issues that took place, that need to take place in terms of policy." He said, in his words, we let ourselves off the hook because we felt like the process of healing, he said, we tied things up with a bow of forgiveness. And so people moved on. And that's one of the things that I would offer, based on my experience being back in Charleston, is that, and for you to consider, is that the permanence and consistency of a moral voice, in passing gear language that David and Randy and others would understand, the ability to take a countercultural position and keep that position in the forefront in ways that only the faith community can, because of who we are and what we reflect and represent, is a powerful tool to move and advance policy. It was the faith community, frankly, last week when the mayor, or 3 weeks ago, when the mayor called the people who were protesting in downtown Charleston and riots broke out thugs. It was the faith community that called him on that Sunday morning and said to him, if you really want to do something substantive, then you have to do something with the Calhoun statue. And it was the faith community yesterday at 3 o'clock that stood with him as he and the city council committed to taking that statue down by the end of next week. And so it's that moral capital, I firmly believe, that's so important to the work that we do. Just a couple things before I open up for question and answer. Randy, please just keep me on time. I mentioned that the faith community had a principal role in this as, I think, a voice, in some cases crying in the wilderness, but a voice necessary and essential. That our faith community, to a large part, understands the connection between how to advance policy, how to advance sort of more systemic things that need to be done, and so the formation of the Charleston Area Justice Ministries as a permanent source of righteous irritation to the status quo has been very powerful for us as a community. But there's also been, frankly, through our work at the Community Foundation since I've been back, an appreciation for and a compliment to that work. And I think God calls us to the kingdom for opportunities in moments such as this. So my ministry background coupled with my military background, I was a paratrooper, so I'm a little fearless when it comes to certain things. Sort of combines with this idea that if we leverage the tools that we have available appropriately, then we can actually move more quickly than you might think in local communities. So I'll give you a few examples. When I came on board, I actually moved my wife here in December 2015 and then started my role here in February 2016. We started right away, our board, thinking about what role would the foundation play in addressing racial disparities. And quickly we stepped back and said, well, we don't have any credibility in that space. We don't know enough. And so we started working through the Racial Equity Institute. We validated that as a tool. All of our board and staff now have to go through that as a requirement within their first 6 months in engagement with our organization, because it gives us a common language, it gives us a common understanding of history, and more than just the stories or the anecdotes, it gives us a common history of the structural and policy decisions that were made as a country, and in many cases in our communities, that have created the current context in which we find ourselves. So we don't necessarily get stuck on why are these things this way and start looking at individual people. We understand the systemic and structural challenges that people have faced historically. And that makes our work both complex and challenging, but also we're clear-eyed about the fact that we can create and run and manage great programs, but we have to also address structural policies that perpetuate those issues. And so we're doing that. We also realize that within communities, and I think this is important, that we didn't and don't have the credibility like the faith community. So we purposely work with houses of faith and worship. When we right now are working on hate crime legislation as a part of the work that we're doing on racial equity, our Charleston Jewish Federation, led by Judy Corsaro, and our Jewish Endowment Foundation, which is a supporting org of our foundation, are the leaders in that effort because of the amount of anti-Semitism that's going on here in our community over the last 5 years or so. And so we follow and support where it makes sense. Reverend Rivers and other pastors, where we've played a role is we've been able to bring those groups together and say, you don't need to work out here on your own. You're doing great work. How can we bring those two groups together and work consistently, and then share in the workload? Two are better than one in any instance. And so we're doing a bit of that. We've also worked really hard to build this understanding of the structural, the racial history of structural racism in our community and country by offering REI to any and everyone. We've trained well over 1,000 people in our region. All of us now approach, we can say things like white people and black people without feeling, funny. Like someone could refer to me if they've never seen me or heard me or know me as, Darrin Goss. Well, I don't know that person. Well, he's the Black CEO of the Community Foundation. Not that should matter, but people, we just have a freedom that frees us to talk about race in ways that I think that's healthy for communities, and especially faith communities, to be able to do. We recognize that variation in color historically has meant something, but we don't let that challenge us in the work that we need to do going forward. We actually own the fact that we're different and we come from different places, and that brings power to the conversations we're having. So REI has been important for us. We've also started to advance the conversation in ways that are tangible with our business community as well. Boeing, a big manufacturing company, moved here several years ago. They moved here and occupied a portion of North Charleston called Liberty Hill, one of the oldest historic Black communities in Charleston. And essentially, we're making grants and gifts and doing a lot of work everywhere else. And you wouldn't be surprised to know that Reverend Rivers and pastors in that community over the last several years have engaged Boeing and making not only financial investment in in that immediate community, but also making social investment. People show up and making intellectual investment. People volunteer and doing the kind of things, putting their reputational capital behind under-resourced nonprofits that wouldn't otherwise be on the radar of a lot of people. And so that's a very powerful thing that has happened here. I'll end with a couple of quick lessons learned, and then we can engage in some question and answer. The first thing is tragedies, and we've lived through our fair share in Charleston. Tragedies like this happen, and the temptation is to let ourselves off the hook because we've done enough. We've had the vigils, we've had the joint services, we've done all of those things, and we've not really taken that next step and put our personal, congregational, or reputational capital on the line to see to the systemic changes that need to happen. And so what I think we realize now in hindsight, 5 years later, and what we're still, I think, struggling to address is how to move policy forward. How do we actually do the things, not just at the state or local municipal level, but even in our own practices as organizations that we lead and run. So we're turning that microscope on ourselves. I mean, we're doing audits of our own work, our own grant making. We're challenging people who are our vendors as a foundation to do the same thing. If you say you have a diversity, equity, and inclusion policy, we want to see how you're making progress on that. It just can't be words. What are you doing? And we're firing people, frankly, who aren't living up to that. And so we've said as an organization, we want to associate with people that make us credible in the work that we do. So when we show up in community, people can't point to our board, our staff, or our vendors even, and say you're being hypocritical. You're saying one thing, doing something else. So the symbols are good. The vigils are wonderful. The healing has to take place. But after the healing, what we've learned and what we're still dealing with now is we've got to get to the structural issues. We've got to get to that. And then the last sort of big lesson learned that I think is a very positive takeaway, which we didn't do this time, by the way, after George Floyd, is in no substantive way did that same group of faith leaders come together prior to the protests in Charleston 3 weeks ago on that Saturday and said, let's talk about this, what happened in Minneapolis. I'm struggling with that because I wonder, is it because it didn't happen in Charleston and happened somewhere else? Because it didn't happen to the church, it happened somewhere else? Was it because George Floyd had a sketchy background that people sort of found out later? Well, the lesson I think we're talking about here in Charleston with the faith community, at least my friends and colleagues, is why didn't we have the same response as a faith community? Knowing what we had just lived through 5 years ago, knowing that we were a month away from Mother Emanuel. And that's something that we have to work through. It just can't be because it's proximate. It's got to be because it's a human issue that all of us feel and experience every day. So anyway, I'll stop there. Randy, I don't know if we have questions, Sarah, but I'm happy to respond to any that you have.
So, Darrin, thank you so much for these remarks. I know Sarah has a lot of questions for you, and she's been collecting them from our participants in the chat. But I just want to kick off with this one. So how do we organize our interfaith faith community into a passing gear, living, breathing force? Because what you just said about 5 years later and where's the faith community now, I think you're right. We've just all, you know, had rallies, and they were very good. And, you know, we're only where we are on the timeline, but we're all in conversation with each other, almost everyone on this call, about how do we really organize ourselves to use the power of what we're about and what prize we have our eyes on. How do we make that happen? You might want to say a little bit more about Passing Gear to introduce your remarks.
Yeah, so Passing Gear, thank you for that question, Randy. Passing Gear is a framework, a mindset. David Dodson would describe it, Ambassador Jim Joseph would describe it as a habit of the mind and an orientation of the spirit. It really does help you and us understand that philanthropy has far more at its disposal than just financial capital. It has social capital, the networks like this one. It has moral capital, if exercised, the ability to take a countercultural position, changing the narrative about what's right, challenging the status quo. Intellectual capital, that we can bring people together in ways and provide information and data in ways that can actually help in decision making. Reputational capital, that reputational capital of both the organization and individual actually can move forward certain things, and then of course financial capital. Passing Gear also has 5 traditions of philanthropy that we work through that I think is important. It's a tradition of philanthropy that we tend to know most of as charity. If someone's hungry, we should feed them. If someone's homeless, we should house them. If someone's been abused, we should bind up the wound, stop the bleeding, and find a place of rest for that weary soul. But that has limits. You can't fund your way out of that kind of thing. Philanthropy as improvement. You teach a person to fish rather than give them a fish. Philanthropy as social reform talks to this issue of policy and how do we change policy. The challenge to that is who gets to decide what's changed. Philanthropy as civic engagement, the 4th tradition, is that we should come together and connect with the community, that the community should have a say. But even that's a limit, because it's sort of the impulse is the beloved community. But the coming together may not lead to action. And we've seen a lot of that over the last 5-10 years, where we have a lot of vigils and things that come together. And then the 5th tradition is philanthropy is racial healing and reconciliation, which we think is very important, particularly in the times in which we live. So to a network like this, and I saw someone asked a question about Charleston Area Justice Ministries. Charleston Area Justice Ministries is a separate nonprofit. It is a collaboration of tens of probably 100 churches locally, congregations. They have an executive director, Ms. Treva Jenkins. I can get Sarah, I can give you her information. They use direct action. They come together. I mean, they had a call a couple of weeks ago. There were 1,000 people on the call. They meet regularly. They figure out a course of action that they're going to focus on for the year, and those congregations work on it. And typically, the course of action has something to do with some structural issue that they're trying to address. Right now, they're working on affordable housing in North Charleston, and it's powerful. No one congregation has to do all the lifting. All of those congregations, all of those congregants come together and they divide up the work. It's heavy volunteerism. I think Treva, frankly, is the only paid staff, but it's organized and it's white, it's black, it's Jewish, it's all faith traditions. So that's the way it's organized. How does that work with a Passing Gear lens? They understand the social capital because they're tapping into a network of congregations that when they show up, it's thousands of people. They understand their voice in terms of moral capital. I mean, they question, it was the Charleston Area Justice Ministries that put enough pressure on the police chief in Charleston to where he said, you know what, I'm not willing to make the substantive changes, so I'm going to leave. And that wasn't a bad thing for Charleston, the city of Charleston, because now we have an excellent police chief that's taken what this community is saying seriously and doing the things within his power within the police department to take care of the structural challenges that they're experiencing. That doesn't happen without Charleston Area Justice Ministries understanding its role and playing its role. And then thirdly, I think they built credibility over the last 25 years from a reputational capital. When Treva calls me and says, I need to do A, B, or C, or I want to meet with A, B, C, I'm like, Treva, you tell me who and what and when, and I'll try to move heaven and earth to make it happen. Because they are such an important force in our community. And they don't hide the fact that they are a faith-based organization, which to me is very powerful.
And Darrin, just one follow-up comment. Thank you so much. Those 5 traditions of philanthropy and 5 kinds of philanthropic capital that you described, that's true for philanthropy, but would you agree it's also true about the faith community and the nonprofit community? We all have those kinds of capital and traditions within which we can work.
Yeah, I met MDC, got introduced to it in 2009 when I was in Greenville, South Carolina, and still actively pastoring a church. And I think David knows this, and I won't look at him on my screen, but it literally changed. It changed the way I thought about what's possible in communities. As a military officer, I've been around the world and I've seen probably the worst of humanity, and I've seen the best of humanity. And I had a hard time as a pastor reconciling, frankly, what I'd seen, what I'd lived, and what I was preaching every day, and how to make that tangible for people individually, organizationally, how to make that tangible. And the 5 traditions and the 5 forms of capital just gave me an easy framework by which to help people understand you can make a difference at the individual level. Use your social capital. Use your ability to speak up, even if it's in your own family. You have some things and some knowledge that we don't know from just the experience you've lived. That's intellectual capital you can share, right? And then just understand where your passions are. If you feel like you just want to help that person who's down on their luck, wonderful. I've had congregants that said, Pastor Goss, I understand what you want to do with trying to get housing over here in the projects better, but I'm more inclined to just make sure that the homeless people have some place to sleep that's warm. Spartanburg, South Carolina gets cold in the winter. I said, you do that work, and what I would do is encourage them to do the work that they're passionate about, that they feel called to. But it gave all of us, frankly, a common way and understanding to know that as a disciple of Christ in my faith belief, that they had value to the kingdom, and that value could be articulated in ways that Passing Gear really helped me to do. And so, yes, I think it's appropriate application across our communities, but particularly in congregations if they choose to understand it.
Wonderful. Thank you for that answer and that explanation of Passing Gear. We've got a couple questions here, and I want to share one from Blair Pogue. She says, what steps, if any, have more progressive faith communities in Charleston taken to reach out to and build bridges with more moderate and conservative faith communities so that they can work together to address systematic racial issues and structures?
Yeah, you know, a lot of the relationships and a lot of the relationships that were formed immediately after Mother Emanuel, I think, continue to this day. You know, there was a lot probably for those first 6 months, you know, pulpit sharing or things like that. Some of that still goes on. It's loose. I think in our analysis, we haven't frankly done enough to move forward people in terms of their thinking. I've you know, frankly, Sarah, been a little disappointed that we haven't been able to pull more moderate voices of influence along on the Charleston Area Justice Ministries. Maybe they're just too far out there for some folks, but we've got a lot of work to do in that area because of the social, structural, political power structure in Charleston. We need to have those large, predominantly white, wealthy congregations on board with this work. If you read my piece, I'm Not All Right, you know that I don't think that the racial issues and the racism is a Black community problem. I think it's a majority community problem that can be addressed quickly if, frankly, places where power aggregates lead the charge. So anyway, we've got work to do there.
Wonderful. Yes. And we do have that piece. And if you give us permission, Darrin, we would love to share that with the group. It's a wonderful piece.
Sure.
Okay, wonderful.
Now,
Our next
we got two pieces. I want to make sure, Randy, we don't share the second
We won't
one.
share that other one. No,
All right.
just the one. Yeah, for sure.
Right.
Sherry Presteman from the United Church of Christ asked, to what extent has specific conversations or work around reparations been part of the experience in Charleston?
Yeah, we have had a lot of conversations here locally around reparations with our, we have, as you probably know, it's so interesting, Charleston and the Charleston area has two Democratic congressmen, Congressman Joe Cunningham that won his seat 2 years ago, was up for re-election, and Congressman Jim Clyburn, who is the Democratic whip. And so we've been working directly with them on reparations. I think at the local level, there are a lot of conversations, but not a lot of action. Right now, it's a lot of rhetoric, frankly. People don't understand it. People push back on it. How would you determine who gets it and all these other things? Our position as a community foundation has been to say, well, while you may not want to talk about reparations, let's talk about equity. Let's talk about how we are investing the current resources today and how we might invest those resources differently tomorrow to level a playing field. Now, a bit of that understanding is to be truth-telling about why we are where we are. And that's where the Racial Equity Institute has played a pivotal role in helping people who make decisions about resources to understand that people aren't just lazy or criminal. They've been criminalized and devastated, disadvantaged for the history of our country, and that we should think differently about how we invest resources. And with that grounding in our history and our policy, we can now have a different conversations, not necessarily reparations, but a different conversations about how to invest equitably. How do we look at the work through an equity lens? I'll give you one example that's clearly about this. We have one of the highest performing high schools and elementary schools. That's a public school, and one of the in the country, and one of the lowest performing schools in the state of South Carolina. If you know anything about education in South Carolina, we rank near the bottom with Mississippi and Alabama, separated by about 1.5 miles. One school is predominantly white and public. One school is predominantly Black and public. And when 5 years ago, if we were having this conversation, people were saying, you're taking away from this group to give to this group to have seats at those schools for minority students who have proven themselves academically gifted to be able to get there. Our school district last December passed a sweeping amount of educational reform that guarantees seats to minority students who have proven themselves academically at two of the top public schools, an elementary school and a high school in South Carolina. And that's even with constituent school boards that were designed in 1967 to segregate our city and our educational system. I don't think, Sarah, we get to where our school district is today if we didn't have the conversation about racial equity through the Racial Equity Institute and had that fundamental understanding that the structural differences, not personal effort or anything else, is what has caused the disparities we see. And so we've said, let's talk about equity, and then let's make the investments we need to make to actually get the things done we need to get done.
Awesome. Awesome. The chat's going crazy, so I'm just scrolling through. A question came through, and I'm trying to find it, from Bill Goodwin. How have you found faith communities having needed conversations to bring about racial reconciliation with political divisions? Or are politics necessary to be in the conversation?
Politicians necessary?
Politics in general.
Yeah, well,
It's a big question.
yeah, Charleston's, again, it's a community of contradictions. We fashion ourselves the holy city. Everyone here on Sunday or Saturday or somewhere is in a house of faith. And really up until 2015, we didn't mix ministry and policy and politics.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the Mother Emanuel massacre and the sort of racial awakening, if you want to call it that created, has really sort of blurred the lines between that. And so I hear more and more both politicians, white and black, congregations, talking about these issues through a racial lens. I said earlier, for the most part, we can talk about race and talk about the differences and disparities based on race without people, by and large, getting their backs up and walking away from the conversation. And I think that's a good thing. I still think we have a lot of work to do, but it's happening, and I think it's been good. I don't frankly think the Calhoun statue comes down. And that conversation is even a conversation yesterday. If our faith community, business community, and broader community hadn't been having these conversations over the last 5 years.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So we've got one from Prahat. Are there any specific steps along the line of educating the Charleston Police Department and officers about the communities of diverse cultures with their diverse customs and ways of working?
Can you say the first part of that question again?
Specific steps along the line of educating the Charleston Police Department and officers about the communities of diverse cultures with their diverse customs and ways of working.
Yeah, not that I know of.
Okay.
Not that I know of. I do know, I think our community is, frankly, it's not as diverse as Minneapolis. And so we are under no illusion that if we're going to talk about diversity honestly in our community, we have to talk about Black and brown people. Mm-hmm. And we have to talk about that from our cultural, historical context, if we're going to be honest and authentic about trying to move the needle on these things. I know Chief Reynolds feels that way. He is not yet committed to carrying his police force through REI. Chief Burgess feels that way. He's made that commitment to understanding the structural issues. Our county sheriff has not been on board, and so we're working on him. But we firmly believe cultural competency is important. Mm-hmm. Understanding customs are so important, but understanding that a young person who is disenfranchised because they can't find employment and because they're not, because they feel a sense of apathy, doesn't make him a criminal when you show up. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That there's reasons for why things happen, and that appreciation and level of understanding we think is important for the police force to get. When people come in to a low-income community with assumptions about that community and their value, mm-hmm. Then the things that have happened continue to happen.
And we had someone asked, our board chair, Bill Brady, asked just a question. It's been here in Minnesota and Minneapolis specifically, we do have a police union and our union head is under fire, rightfully. So he's wondering, does Charleston have a police officers union? And if so, what has their reaction been to some of the reform efforts since the massacre?
I don't know. I don't think we do. Organized labor is not big in South Carolina for historical reasons, dating back to the 1930s and 40s. We have organizations that protect workers, if you will, that probably wouldn't classify themselves as unions, but I don't know about a police union specifically.
Okay, awesome, thank you. David Dotson asks, the social frustrations we see are about justice, but underneath them are also about racialized disparities in opportunity and the American dream. How is Charleston's faith community interrogating and acting to change the economic disparities that breed frustration and anger?
Yeah, the first year after Mother Emanuel, David, thank you for that question. The College of Charleston Avery Institute, with funding from a bunch of different folks, the foundation and Google, started to do a report called the Racial Disparities Report. It's available online if you want to see it, but it's a comprehensive report that just highlights the racial disparities in Charleston, South Carolina. And David, that is a document that Charleston Area Justice Ministries, congregations, the Interfaith Network here we refer to almost, dare I say, religiously, to back up the direct action that's happening right now in our community. The fact that a couple of years ago, Cajun was on Charleston Area Justice Ministries, was on police reform, and they hadn't moved away from that. They're still working, but now they're working on, we would call it economic mobility through affordability of housing. Housing helps to build wealth. There's no surprise to that because of the racial disparities report and the information in there. And frankly, one of the things that we pushed for was, so what are the solutions, policy and otherwise, that can be done? And so a lot of what's being taken up, both from a policy standpoint, but also programmatically, comes from that racial disparities report.
I'm gonna let, Randy has a follow-up question.
Thanks so much for that, Darrin. Structural reform will unfold over time, hopefully faster rather than slower if we're all engaged in our work. My question is a follow-up to David's. In the meantime, while we have so many families living in terrible economic conditions, what's the work before us to help individual families overcome barriers while we're working to take apart those barriers? And what role, if any, should the faith community have in that work?
Yeah, I'm either blessed or cursed with the experience of being a military officer who did logistics for 10 years, and a minister who's pastored 3 churches, and now a leader of a foundation. I think within communities, this kind of network is so important to helping the community understand where, in fact, groups like these, organizations or nonprofits, need to both continue to focus and scale their work, but then align the effort. And so we're really trying to do that in our community. And I think for your community, it's the same thing. There's the tradition of philanthropy called philanthropy as relief or charity. We have to do that. As a matter of fact, the hallmark of a caring community is just that. And how do you scale that work and make sure that everyone who needs food has it, particularly in the midst of a pandemic, where they may have lost a job, while at the same time trying to skill them up for a new workforce opportunity, because we know the dynamics of the economic disruption. Some jobs will never come back. Some organizations won't come back. And so I think we have to do both. I think, the Annie Casey Foundation, I know MDC is big on integrated service delivery, where you have people who you triage, you find out where they are, you provide coaching and support, and then you help them help themselves, frankly, the second tradition. and then you support them along the way. That's a lot easier lift for a community than trying to do all here or there. Then there's the policy issue. The faith community, specifically to your question, I don't know how many, it's 96 people on this call. How many people in your community these 96 congregations represent? I think from a information sharing process, getting the word out is sort of using your social capital to say, here's where the opportunities lie. Here's how you navigate the systems. I think it's important for the faith community to be a conduit of that kind of information because it's powerful. If you have, like I think most people do, missions or some other kind of thing, how do you align that work with the congregation down the street so you're not duplicating effort in ways that really perpetuate some of the systemic challenges that we find ourselves in? Philanthropy is social reform needs to happen, the practices that sort of undergird the challenges. So I think the faith community has something to say. I also believe that in ways that I used to do when I actively pastored a church, when we did outreach, we counted. When we did a Wednesday night, we called it Wellness Wednesdays once a month with our FQHC, and we would do glucose screenings and all of that stuff. We counted people. And then I said to myself, you know what, we got a problem. We got all these problems. We're a small church. We got all these problems. I'm going to go join the board of the FQHC. So I joined the board of Regenesis in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And I said, you know what, I need to help you create more capacity because the needs that we see you're not able to address it. The free clinic can't address it, and people can't afford to go to Spartanburg Regional. We need to build your capacity. And so I invited myself to be a part of that. And I think as faith leaders, as people with influence, I think we've got to think about ways that we can engage beyond the work we do in our congregation to start to use our own social capital to start to change the dialogue in institutions or organizations about how they invest their resources or how we might grow what they do. That Wellness Wednesday was good, but there was a larger structural problem that we needed to address. And that I felt like at the time, that was a way I could address it. And so I think those are the ways that faith community leaders can be involved and engage their congregations in the deep work to try to solve some of these issues. Because I think you can do what you have to do, what you can do. No one congregation can do it all. And I think that's the conversation we should be having in the faith community.
Darrin, that's wonderful. And those are really all of our questions. I will give it just maybe another, one just popped in. Does your organization offer opportunities, and should we as faith community offer opportunities for prayer to tear down the walls of principalities and powers that have been in place for years? How did that look?
Yeah, the way we engage community, because we are not outwardly a faith organization, but obviously I don't hide the fact to anyone who knows me, my faith background. They hired me anyway, is what I say. And so we engage people, again, with this love for humanity to say, your voice is important to us and your faith tradition is up to you, but we want you at the table. And so we give space. Some people say safe space. I learned from Dr. Gail Christopher that we should use compassionate space, because you shouldn't come together and people just say what they want to without regard for how it affects the people who are listening to it. So we try to create compassionate space for people to express themselves. So Randy's been in our office. She knows we've got this collaborative space, which is a part of why we located here in this particular community, to bring people together. So our donors who are ultra wealthy bump into community neighborhood association presidents who are on fixed income, and we bump into each other in the hallways or in the collaborative space, and we talk about, when we could, we get together, we talk about what's going on in our communities. And that's a powerful thing. It gives space for that. I think the faith community, frankly, and I do this all the time, should be praying for and with continuously our communities and our leaders in our communities. I think the Apostle Paul says it in 2 Timothy chapter 2, we ought to offer prayers and supplications for those who are in charge, the leaders around us. And we should do that all the time. And where people can and want to, we should lock arms with them. When George Floyd happened, and we processed that as a foundation staff team, I think it's appropriate, and I did, and I always do when we have tragedies. We did it after Parkland. We did it after the attack in Pittsburgh and in San Diego. Is I offered a prayer for my staff, and I said, "Do you guys mind if I pray for you and pray with you and pray for our community?" And we did, and I think that's showing up in that way is important. If you're a nonprofit leader, if you're a faith leader who doubles as a nonprofit leader, I think that's important to do. It's leadership by example, I think.
Wonderful. I realized I missed one, Darrin, so apologies for that. I'm just going to scroll all the way up here. How are faith communities in Charleston working with the chief of police, the mayor, on rethinking what public safety might look like and what the new role of the police force should be? A big conversation we're having here in Minneapolis is defunding the police.
Yeah, I think both Chief Reynolds and Chief Burgess have been very open to hearing from faith leaders. So I mentioned the police audit that the Illumination Project supported in the immediate aftermath of Mother Emanuel. CAJM, Charleston Area Justice Ministries, continued to work with that. Chief Mullen left. Chief Reynolds is on board, and they're executing that, but they're executing that with ongoing work with Dr. Kylon Middleton, who I mentioned earlier, who is a pastor at the local church at the Mount Zion Church in downtown Charleston. So there's a constant information loop. I think I wouldn't describe it this way. I would describe it this way, but it's probably not as formal as it may sound. I think that there are key faith leaders in our community that are de facto advisors to our chiefs when it comes to this work. There has been calls here locally for defunding the police. I think those voices are minimal compared to the voices that know and understand that at least two of our chiefs are making a real effort at doing the policy reform that needs to take place since 6 years ago with Denzel Cornell.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you, Darrin. I will let Randy jump in.
I want to thank Darrin, Reverend Goss, for this wonderfully thought-provoking inside view of Charleston, critical thinking view of the forces that have been acting in Charleston before 5 years ago and in the last 5 years, and for participating so graciously in this discussion with our faith leaders so we can start to incorporate your thinking into ours. I have believed for a long time, and now maybe our community will be thinking about how much the North has to learn from the South. So we want to thank you for that from the bottom of our hearts, and hope we can stay in touch almost as sister cities and keep learning from each other on the roads we're both on. And at this moment, I'd like to turn to Pastor Carl Walker. Reverend Walker is the senior pastor of Morning Star Missionary Baptist Church. He is the co-founder, or as I like to say, he's the Walker in Walker West Music Academy, the esteemed music school in our community. It's won national awards. It's amazing And he is the designer and the leader of our community's Community Power Up program, an intensive program in the Selbydale community to infuse the community with a full understanding of their legal rights, financial strategies, and then one-on-one free clinics to make those rights a reality. And so, Reverend Walker, I would ask, would you do us the honor of delivering the closing prayer, please?
Shall we pray? Oh, gracious Creator, how grateful we are for this great opportunity to hear Pastor Darrin Goss. And thank you, oh God, for the Interfaith Action Group and Randy, who so magnificently carried this conversation into a higher heights and a deeper depths. Lord, we ask that you grant us wisdom and knowledge so that we will be able to carry those things that we have learned here today to our communities so that we can be better. Bless us as we leave from here. Keep us by your grace, and most of all, give us that love that makes us the communities that we should be. We give all of the praise and thanks to you, our gracious Creator. Amen.